I'm really glad to be with you today, listeners to the Sanctuary podcast, and to be with my friend Ruwan. Good morning, Ruwan. How are you today?
Hey, morning, Angel. I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very excited, in fact, about that conversation. And I've known your wife for many, many years.
hmm
In fact, before even you guys even met, because I was a student of her, and I got to discover this topic of relationship, sacred relationship, being in partnership. And how do we step into this container of connection with authenticity, with our power, with vulnerability, with strong communication? And I've been really fascinated by the subject. I think, what I want to say before we dive into this conversation is what I've witnessed, and what we were talking about is very often the healing community, or as individuals, we go into our healing from a very individualistic perspective, right? About what we need to fix or what we need to change in ourselves. And traditionally, healing was very collective. It was done at a tribe level, at a community level. In fact, we would never really go unless we have a big illness just for healing. But even in that case, we will look at why this illness appeared in the systems that we are in, right? Is it related to our land? Is it related to our waters? Is it related to our family dynamics, to our ancestors, to, many things that are in the collective? And so the sacred relationship theme that we're going to explore today, for those of you that are listening to us, is really the idea that there might be things that are in the way of us connecting to what we might call our soulmate or ideal partners. I don't never use the term soulmates, but many people use it. And what can we do to really maybe finally explore a relationship that is more harmonious, where there's no patterns of rejections or running away and coming back, pushing and pulling that we might experience a lot in relationship, and how do we create harmony? So I'm excited to discuss all that with you, Ren, and maybe other things that you want to bring on that subject. So first, let me ask you a little bit about your background, and if you can connect it to that theme, right? And why you're here
Totally.
today, and what people should know about you.
Yeah, and I actually say, before I even share about myself, I do think that's the big conflict, especially for people who've worked on themselves, people who are conscious, is the individualism versus collectivism. And a relationship, by definition, is a collective of at least two people, right? And on that, I started my personal development journey probably the same reason most people do. I was upset about my life. I had certain anxieties, social anxieties. So relating to people was like actually my biggest focus right in the beginning. I went through many different mini journeys through that. I spent some time in like sexual intimacy, the tantra world, gained some things. Also, I think gained some negatives from that world when it comes to relationship that we can speak about. And then most recently, I've been working with men specifically with intimacy stuff, but really on life. I think the virtues that are relevant to men kind of apply universally. I think it's a little bit different for women. We can get into that as well. And I'm a recent father, so family has been a big focus of mine, or it's colored my view of how men should show up in the world, in relationship and family, obviously, but also in society. And I'm also a history buff, and I have a side project where I speak about the history of man from a cultural evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, and we will dive a bit into that, right? See where we're coming from, really, because we evolved over tens of thousands of years, and now we live a very modern lifestyle that's very different from how we evolved, and we have a lot of traits and behaviors that are connected to this primal and more ancient way of living, right?
Totally. Yeah, because I think, a lot of the cultural questions, regardless of which side you are in the modern culture wars, a lot of them are actually easy to answer. a lot of people spend so much time in like the abstract world of, philosophizing back and forth, whether it's from a spiritual angle, spiritual bypassing, or, citations you see in every argument online. People are using, the same type of argument back and forth. But if we look at nature and we look at history, and which also means looking at biology, like where we evolved from to becoming these conscious sacks of cells that can have a podcast conversation, the answers are there, right? It's not an abstract thing. As much as I love spirituality and looking at the spiritual lenses, it's there. We all of our emotions, our tendencies, the good, the ugly, have all come from something, from some reason.
Yeah. And I think, one of my spiritual teacher, elder, that I've been working with for over 15 years, told me one day, say, the hardest ceremony of life is relationship, is being in a relationship. No other ceremony you are going to enter is going to be as hard as that. And it could be a relationship with a partner. It could be a relationship with your child. It could be a relationship maybe with your parents, right? There are many types of relationship, but today we want to focus more on a partner level, right? People partnering together in some forms to build a life. So you said you were in the tantric world a little bit, and you are a father. You have a beautiful child, and I got to hang out with you guys when I was in Peru, and that was so lovely. So what brought you to that subject? I mean, obviously you said you were searching for your own healing, but like specifically about the idea of relating as a man, I guess, but also, what was there for you that you were not finding maybe in your education or from your parents or from society?
Yeah, I mean, rewinding even like a decade earlier, when I was even 12 to 16, I was very depressed. And a lot of my depression came from what we could maybe call social anxiety now. Then I didn't know what was wrong. I didn't know what to call it, right? I just had a lot of issues with communicating. I had a very hard time making friends. And even with my existing friends, I had a hard time feeling like I could express myself. So I went through, I searched, this is internet 20 something years ago. So there's some dark corners. The first thing that I ended up spending time, like really investing time in, was what we now call the pickup community, because if you were 15 and you searched online for how to not be shy, that's what came up.
What is that? I'm curious now.
Oh, you haven't heard of the pickup artist community?
No,
It's like,
tell me more.
okay. Well, anyway, it's a big, it started in the early 2000s. Basically men giving very left-brained advice to other young men on how to date. So a lot of it, and a lot of the thought leaders there were coming from an engineering background, and they were trying to break down human interaction with women in a very, we could say robotic way. And you could find certain success there, but it was like completely lacking in heart and empathy. And nowadays, I'm sure many listeners are familiar, there's been a lot of negative, a lot of accusations of misogyny and other negative things. But in my opinion, really all of that came from the fact that they were trying to apply an engineer's mindset to human connection, which is it's not even the most effective way. It's like trying to hear a color. It's like the wrong sense, right? It's
Yeah,
like
we're not machine. That would make things more simple. Maybe sometimes we are a bit more complex.
So actually I had some negatives, even though it did help me break out of my shell when I was like really going on workshops where you go out and talk to 100 women in a night. It was beneficial in some ways because it was more people. I spoke to more people than I normally would have at that age. But it came with a lot of negatives too, where I was too in my head. I wasn't feeling. I had certain other issues that came from basically learning to not feel when you're communicating with someone, which is the opposite. It's like closing your ears when you're trying to listen to music. So that brought me into the more sexuality focused thing, not necessarily because of sexuality, but because of the emphasis on feeling. Like I recognized I had some problems because I was thinking too much and feeling too little. And I studied with certain groups. The general tantra world has a lot of feeling and connection, which is great. Something though I'm looking back now from a pretty recent perspective is that while they teach the skill of intimacy, and like how to really drop in with a person eye gazing and really connect with someone maybe in the first time you're intimate. There's something always that has to be withheld in order to do that well. Like in order to just fully open with a stranger, which is a great skill in some settings, you have to also be able to protect the part of you that gets triggered when we're in relationships. So you see a lot of those people, and so like a lot of my really good friends or tantric educators, this is not to disparage anybody, but I do see a lot of people with this skill very highly developed. They developed it because they were able to protect some part of themselves. And then it all comes out when they're really romantically intimate in a way that maybe is even worse than someone who never took a tantra workshop, maybe in some cases, because they've learned to like hide that particularly vulnerable part and open everything else. They've learned to be maybe literally naked in front of strangers because they have detached from whatever natural embarrassment comes from that. I don't know if that's the best example, but like that kind of thing, you
Yeah,
know?
I hear you totally.
Yeah.
So
So yeah.
yeah, so sacred relationship, how would you define that? And would you apply that to your relationship today? And maybe what are the steps? What is it, and how do we really get there? What's in the way?
Yeah. And that's not a term I use personally, just like soulmate, but we need to call it something, right? So actually my wife and I, we've been talking about like, what is like the defining characteristic of the relationship we want to strive for? And it's actually the thing that we've already mentioned, this individualism versus collectivism. I think a lot of people, especially free spirits, feel they have to compromise too much in a relationship. Or I mean, this is just a general thing. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of that just is a general belief in society that you have to lose some of yourself. And for us, we wanted to find a way where that's not in conflict. The extreme opposite being relationship is where you get to be yourself the most. In fact, you get to be yourself in a healthy relationship. You get to be yourself and maybe discover great parts of yourself that maybe you couldn't even do as an isolated individual, you know? And that's what we strive for, at least as an ideal.
I like that. I like that definition. So what are some of the good, let's start by the good first, the good indicator that that relationship is, I don't know, balanced, healthy? Well, what are the things you look at or you explore? And I'm guessing in your own relationship where you say, well, those are a good indicator that there is
Mhm.
some strengths there. um, and that you say, well, yeah, this is the work we've been doing, right? This is, I know when I do that, or when we're able to maybe even argue together, right, to have
Mhm.
conflict to a certain degree, that for me is a sign that it's a healthy relationship. So what are the signs or the things we look at when we talk about
Yeah.
sacred relationship or good
Well,
partnership, let's say?
starting with like really concrete things that I do like monitor regularly is how much we laugh together. Uh, when we come back together after being physically apart, is there excitement there? Um, and even actually, I just thought of this now because you brought up fighting. It's like when we argue, which is natural, uh, I still see her as beautiful in the middle of the argument. Like that to me is a sign that even though we're arguing, the relationship's in a very good place. Like if I have that perception of myself. And then on a more zoomed out level, looking at your life together compared to before, seeing that you get to do more things. I mean, as a person, you're expressing yourself more, compared to obviously the negative is easier to observe. Like if you compare your single life to your relationship life and you're less expressive, you're less funny, you're less uh, happy, obviously, that's obviously not a good thing. It's the negative side. So striving for the opposite of that.
Yeah. So my experience, and also as a personal experience in my life, but also as witnessing with my clients or in our community, is that I feel we are living in a world that's very polarized, right? People have very strong opinions and belief systems. There's not always a lot of flexibility around that. And I feel that, or witness that, every time conflict arises, people have a quick tendency to just leave the space, right? Like we cannot be in spaces if there is disagreements. right? And I feel somehow it has increased the polarization, because then people just hang out with whoever they feel is aligned, with their belief system, with their values, and all of that. And I feel somehow it's preventing us to really unite as a collective.
Mhm.
But why I'm bringing that is that I often see that in individuals that also have a very hard time to be in a relationship, to being committed. I'm talking long-term relationship, right? And maybe some people say, well, I'm not for a relationship. I want to be single all my life. I'm a free spirit or independent spirit, right? But I feel there's kind of a correlation in our capacity to be with discomfort, to be with an opinion that's different than ours, and our capacity to, at the same time, staying connected with ourselves and with the other person. For me, the greatest difficulty, I guess, is how do I stay engaged with someone that I disagree with? Could be my wife, could be whoever it is, right? If there is a strong argument or difference of opinion, how do I choose love and connection over what you were mentioning earlier, which is what I believe in or who I am or my power, maybe however I define it, right? So there is kind of tension here, right?
Yeah, I think one of the troubles with modern life is that since we spend so much time online, and for the first time in history, we have access to everyone, there's almost this paradox of choice, which you see a lot when people are dating a lot. They say they want a relationship and then they never find one, is because they have 100 other Tinder matches that they could go to if there's even a slight inconvenience with the person they're with. And then when you look at relationship, there's something like this where, people, a lot of times it's like attachment chemicals that keep someone in a relationship. And once those fade or something challenges them, they're immediately thinking about someone else. Where I was just speaking to some of my clients, some guys on this, is that this is the first time in human history where a man can even observe more than 100 women in his lifetime. Like most of human history, most men maybe met 100 women, maybe not even 100 women their entire life. So like it was just that there's a natural appreciation for every single person you met, because there literally wasn't that many. Whereas now, just the idea that there's so many options out there disincentivize like working through discomfort, as you said. And you can see this on many levels, even outside of relationship. Like, we're alternative as a family. We want to live in a communal setting, as almost all, I think, spiritual or people interested in nature. Like this is like a very common hippie thing, right? You want to live in community on land with all your friends. And we've met so many families like this. But it's when it actually comes to anything inconvenient, be it money, be it how to live, it never works out. I mean, it rarely works out, right? Maybe 1% of groups of friends who say this works out, because once there's a disagreement, it's like, well, we're not bonded by blood. We're just going to go to the next community, and you just move. Like there's nothing really tying us. Whereas in, say, a Paleolithic environment, we wouldn't have a choice. We would need each other so much that if someone annoys someone else, you figure out how to make it work. Like this is something you see in like stories of tribal settings. Like forgiveness is such a big thing and sometimes ritualized, because you need each other. You can't kick someone out over some, he made a mistake. Like you have to make things work. And bring this back to relationship, the big extreme opposite of today would be, say, the arranged marriage, which is often seen as this oppressive thing. And maybe it's not something I would necessarily want or employ on my daughter, let's say. But there is something, you look at like some of the more ancient stories of Tantra's origin, this skill of learning to drop in with someone and learning to love the person in front of you, where nowadays it's in an eye gazing ceremony, but it was based on the idea that maybe you don't get to choose who you're with, and you just have to be with this person. And then there's certain skills that are beautiful to learn, where you don't have an option to leave. You have to find a way to make this work and make this happy for both of us. So yeah, I think we've gone a little bit too far, obviously, in the choice and globalization, let's say, of how we relate to people. And I think I do feel like culture is contracting right now. It's contracting to a more conservative, like as an adjective, conservative state, because people are realizing we've gone a little bit too far and anything goes, a little bit too far in individualism. And whether it's family, society, or especially relationship, we could learn a lot more to collectivize, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
to at the very least to be in the same reality as our partner, which is which is how I would define connection. Like to really, you see the world for the most part in the same way, you evaluate reality together in the same way, which includes within the relationship, right? Most fights are disagreement over what's true. It is true of all arguments, actually, right? And if you
and
look
very
at,
or very small things, right? People often break up for like a tiny detail.
yeah,
Sometimes we say over the toilet paper or the toilet seats, or whatever that little things that annoys people every day. But that's true. I want to come back on what we were saying in terms of evolution, right? If 50,000 years ago, or even not that long ago, 10,000 years ago, right, we were to kick someone out of the community or we wanted to leave, it was death, right? You will probably die in the wild, or you will, without your community, you will not be able to survive. So there was no possibility. But there's also community today in many ways that I've met and spent time with that still live that way. And there's still a possibility to live now, nowadays, either it's in jungle in Peru or in the mountainous communities. But there is such commitment to that family. And when I say family, I say beyond the traditional family unit, right? That includes all the elders in the community and the aunt and the aunties and, children in those communities, they call grandpa or father or mother, people that are not genetically their father or their mother or their grandfather, because they are the elders and they are holding all the children's, right? Or they are the parents and they are taking care of all the children's. And there is still a choice to stay there, right? Because people value that type of life. And in my experience, what I've seen is much more regulated children, much more happy relationships and communities, because there is that commitment and that understanding that we are in it together, right? And we are going to need each other. So how do
totally.
we do that? We don't really live that way. For most people, I'm sure listening, we live in a very different environment, and we are very much like spoiled child, right? Everything is available, right? I can eat any food I want. And like you said, well, I can find another partner, I can find another woman, I can find another man, right? Whatever I'm looking for, because there is so much choice. So how do we feel into those values and this kind of different way of relating, and how do we nurture that, given maybe we don't have to, right? Or some people are like, yeah, well, maybe there is a certain level of unhappiness when we keep jumping from one relationship to another or one community to another, and I've seen that a lot, often. But we might not want to wait to be in our 50s or 60s and to feel really lonely, to realize, oh, I should have cultivated that relationship, right? So how do we do that? What's the process?
Yeah, actually, my answer, you just said it. It's for me at least, it's recognizing I'm going to die, because what you just said, that dilemma, it's in everything, right? Like if you're into nature, if you're into exercise, if you're into physical health, all of the tips you see right now are reminding you to do less convenient things that technology can do for us, whether it's like earthing or going hiking or most exercise. Like I'm really into like natural movement. All of it is things that we would normally do if we didn't have cars, like climbing, walking, but now in the first world, in 21st century, you have to have a device on you that reminds you to walk every day, right? Like you have to do all these things. You have to go out of your way. I was trying to hack my sleep a few months ago. So I was sleeping in a tent as opposed to the warm bed. It's like, and it doesn't make sense. Like my friends would tease me, and it doesn't make sense, honestly, when there's something better, but we have to make this constant choice. But the thing is, with relationship, let's say, recognizing that you could save yourself from the inconvenience, you can save yourself from the work, so to speak, by going to the next one. In every individual moment, the truth is, to look at it rationally, it does make sense, right? So someone smells a little funny, someone has a reaction to things you don't like, someone has like a micro trauma that is inconvenient to you, go to the next relationship. And like so many people have done that. I've done that for a lot of my life. But if you recognize that one day you're going to be maybe too old to enjoy the things you want to enjoy with a partner, I think that's the only thing. Because at every age, no matter what, like assuming you're not about to die, it actually is kind of a rational choice if you look at it just in the short term.
Yeah. And I want to explore, another part of that topic, which for me is something that's very alive because something I witness all the time is that the connection between personal trauma and our capacity to relate and to connect. Very often I see people that say, well, this didn't work for me anymore. It could be a relationship, it could be a community, or this I had the intuition or I had the guidance or I had spirit told me, right? I need to do that. And in fact, when you have a little bit of trauma informed background in psychology and in how the body react, when you carry trauma, you are going to very often read the world from that place, right? From that fear place or from that place of protection and safety, which is, what trauma is, right? It's creating a story in the present from something that's happening in the past. And very often, those are very hard parts of us to access, to really see that maybe that pattern or that belief system, even that identity, that, or maybe I'm just a loner, or I want to be single and all of that. In fact, is coming from trauma, but not from our true nature and something deeper in us that's really craving relating, craving intimacy. And yeah, I wonder if it's something that you have experienced or that you see where we have this tendency to read, because I feel, in a world that's quite violent and oppressive, and there is a lot of that. And people sometimes have a very hard time reading into what their decision or where the decision are coming from, right? Or where their patterns are coming from, especially in relationships.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, every not good thing that we do with our partners, like everything that's like hurtful or harmful or, trauma based, is to protect ourselves, right? For some reason, we have to protect ourselves. We have to protect ourselves in intimate moments, whether it's from childhood or whatever. And then it comes out. And I think, at least looking at it from maybe a more rational perspective, this is one of the benefits, I guess, of maybe having multiple relationships through your life, is that if you've done this exact same thing, if you could be honest with yourself to recognize you've done this before, that's pretty much a sign that it's something coming from you. And it could be in your choice of partner. It could be what you incite in the other person. Because this is one thing that I think, when I hear about a lot of pop psychology, like now I think one of the trending topics is, oh, is this person a narcissist? Like I see a lot of that now. It's like labeling the other person, labeling yourself. I'm an avoidant, I'm a fearful, anxious. Everyone likes these labels. Like there's a tendency to say this
empath,
is how I am,
right?
Yeah, exactly. And in reality, and this is more the Jungian perspective, our personalities are like a bunch of different mini programs. Like the basic idea of archetypes essentially is like we have all of these things in us, right? And they get activated in different ways, which is why the way you behave with your parents is different than your coworkers, is different than your lover, etc. And a lot of how we behave, especially in intimate relationship, when the things that come out of us would never come out of us in any other place, it's usually because, let's say my wounded boy is going to attract the overbearing mother in my partner, and they connect, or the opposite, right? Like my stern father and her her little girl are going to find each other. Like these things, they have pairs, right? In fact, they develop because of some other time in our life, whether it's a protection mechanism or aggression or victim mentality. Like they didn't come out of nowhere, and then they find each other. It's like my inner child isn't going to come out at the same time as her inner child, because those two things don't fit. So I think looking at it from an archetypal perspective, I'm not sure this is answering your question, but it's very useful, I think, of like, okay, we're playing a game right now where we're playing these roles. We're doing a little theater right now. And it's obviously very difficult in the moment of intimacy or moment of conflict. But if you could zoom out, or when things have calmed down, and recognize, okay, this is the dynamic we're playing, well, maybe we can choose a different dynamic. And
So
especially when it comes to trauma informed.
Is that what many people very often call soulmate? Is just basically those wounded parts that are reflecting each other and attached to each other. And it can feel really good because it can feel safe, but basically we keep protecting a part or repeating a role and a play without being completely unconscious of it. I mean, not that it's always the case, but I feel it's often the case when we use those terms. Like we feel there's something
Totally.
really strong there, right? But maybe it's from there,
Yeah. I mean, it feels familiar, right?
right?
Like, when we spend time with a little kid, which I've been spending a lot of time now with, like, little babies love repetition, and even young children, they love they want to see the same movie over and over again. It reinforces something. They're building a pathway in their brain that will, the movie, I saw The Lion King 500 times as a kid. Like, it always has a special place in my heart, and every single image from that movie is recognizable, and it brings me back to some feeling, even though I'm not entertained by it. And the same thing with everything that has been like repeated into ourselves. And when we are repeating, say, a victim perpetrator dynamic that happens a lot in both directions, often in a relationship, especially when we're fighting, we're for some reason wanting to hit that button again. And I think it becomes very interesting. And there's not one answer. It's like, why are we hitting the victim button again as a 40-year-old man? Like, why am I hitting this like wounded boy thing? And there's maybe many answers to this, but one could be, okay, this part of you has not been resolved. Like, you're still carrying trauma. There's obviously many routes to healing that kind of thing. But I think, with stuff like this, just recognizing that's what's happening, just like admitting it, I think it's huge, actually. Just like being like, oh, okay, maybe not in the moment when you're in your boy and whining, that's not recognizable, but maybe a second later. Or I think part of what consciousness is having like a shorter time delay before, like, oh yeah, 2 minutes ago, I was being a little boy. And the closer that gets to zero time, I mean, once it gets to zero time, then you have control.
Yeah, it's not already in fact controlling it. It's just first being aware of it, right? It's like, oh yes, this is what's happening here, and maybe I have no hold on it. And maybe next time it's going to get triggered and again and again and again. But like you say, maybe it's not going to come as often because if I'm becoming aware of it, or it's not going to pass for like a whole week before I realize this is what happened last week.
Totally.
This is who was there. In fact, you were not my wife, you were my mother in that scenario, and I was angry, and I was 5, right?
Yeah. Because once you get to noticing it almost in real time, then you have choice. Like, you wouldn't choose to be a little boy, in your relation, maybe not, no, never, like, you wouldn't choose it. So it only happens when you basically lose consciousness for some period of time, and then you go into some dynamic that you wouldn't choose if you were conscious.
So can I ask you a vulnerable question?
Oh yeah, sure.
Question is possible. So what is your pattern? What's the one you say like, no, that's the one I really go to, and you know where it's coming from, and maybe we can give an example there and say, yeah, this is when it show up for me. That's how I do. That's how I shrink, or I small, or I get young, right?
Yeah, well, Nalaya and I, we've had this discussion a bunch the last couple of weeks. So it's, I think we both have a version of martyrdom. Like, we do things that we don't mean, and it comes out a little bit differently for both of us. But I'll say for myself, like, I'll do extra because, oh, I have to do this because the family needs it, or she's in a bad place, but I don't really want to do it. And then it's building up some resentment that I'm going to bring out later. Of like, oh, well, I did all this stuff. I had to take a day off work today because of your needs. And like, it's like thrown back at her later. And actually, even on a deeper level, one of the reasons why we came up with the definition that I mentioned of like a sacred relationship or an ideal relationship is part of mine, at least, is this idea of like, oh, I need to make myself small to accommodate my partner. And it's part of this martyr thing of like, oh, this relationship wouldn't work unless I gave up some of my desires. And then obviously that's not good for the relationship, even to have like anything resembling that thought. So yeah, that's my thing that I'm still like identifying, and as it comes up.
Yeah. So is it like compromise? I feel a lot of time, people think of relationships when you ask, oh, what did it last? Well, I just compromise, right? But when we are compromise, it's like this idea, I'm making myself smaller, right? So I'm not going maybe to voice my whole needs, to take all what I really want, because I'm also in charge of nurturing this relationship, that other person and the relationship. How do you see that idea of compromise? And I know one of part of your work, right, is to really step into your power and to not shy away of who you are, right? To be really this powerful individual, and yet not to be individualistic, to be in relationship in that power. And I feel sometime, even when I think of it for myself, it's like, oh, is it not going to conflict if I do that? Don't I need to sometime bring love to just step down and to give space? What do you think of that? I would love to hear a bit your
Yeah, it's actually something I'm still working through, is like, what is my actual model of this? But I'll tell you the phases I've gone through, which I don't see it as anymore. It's like there's the kind of conventional normie view, let's say, of relationship where you have to compromise. Like, oh, life ends. It's like you see this with children also. Like when a lot of the common verbiage is, oh, your life is over. It's like, same thing with like marriage. Oh, your life is over now. Like all the fun, it's gone, which is really an unfortunate thing. Like if someone actually believes that, I wonder why they would ever actually get married, right? It just seems so unpleasant, right? But then there's, when I was in, a more individualistic personal development, spiritual phase, which I think is a good phase, or at least it was useful for me. There's the extreme belief, the opposite of like, I'm going to do everything I want. I'm not going to, I remember even arguing over the word compromise with an ex-partner. I'm never going to compromise. Like a relationship doesn't work if any person compromises, so we can't ever compromise. And then you have a lot of people, you see this a lot, boldly declaring their desires as if almost from a child perspective of like, oh, well, this has to happen, otherwise I'm leaving. That's kind of almost the underlying thing. And now I'm seeing that, as we've been speaking about, there is a collective element, right? So I'll use an analogy from my work with men. It's like, when a man is really in his masculine, so to speak, there are parts of it that is unpleasant, right? Culture's labeling it as toxic, right? There's things like aggression, the things that are natural even in little boys, and especially in young men when they go through puberty, that are kind of inconvenient to the rest of the tribe. But it has a clear place, right? Earlier tribes would have a rite of passage where it became very clear where his aggression goes. So he wouldn't have this, he wouldn't go around punching people because someone would hand him a weapon or a tool or a
we'll go hunting with the
implement.
men, right?
Yeah. And it was like, this is where your aggression goes. And he would feel fulfilled because that need was fully expressed in a way that actually was beneficial to the tribe. And, bringing this into relationship, I feel like that is part of it, finding where all of your tendencies fit. And then also, I do think, even though I don't believe in soulmates necessarily, and I think men and women, neurotypical men and women, are never going to see the world the same way. Like our brains are different, our hormones are different, our tendencies are different. But for like a mini example, like my wife and I don't agree on everything, but we also don't care about the same things. Like if she wants to paint the house pink, I really don't care. It's not what I would choose. But even though we disagree, like the way we weight those things are completely different. So I'm totally happy for her to make those decisions. And there's not really a conflict. And like, this is kind of moving into what I am now reforming as my ideal view of relationship, of like, in a healthy relationship, each person is fully expressing the things that actually matter to them. And ideally they don't conflict. And I think maybe in a few years I'll change that view of like, okay, well, that's not possible either. I don't know, to be honest, just looking at the way my beliefs have changed. But that's the way I would like to think about it. Like one thing I saw during when the pandemic started in couples I've coached is that things that never seem to matter, as far as like, say, disagreeing about how the world should be run or mandates or whatever, all these hot button topics that are new, some couples turned out that they agreed on everything, and that was great. And then some couples found out for the first time in their relationship that they really strongly view the world differently, which is an unfortunate thing to find out 8 years into a relationship, right? It's like, yeah, it's too bad that didn't come up on the second date or somehow, because now there's something that really does matter where they conflict. Whereas I think it's natural to view the world differently.
Yeah. I mean, I know, in fact, friends that have separated after many years together because they disagreed on the COVID vaccine, right? They had two very different, strong opinions, and somehow it ended up being long arguments over many months. And then they realized that somehow because of that, they had a different view of the world. I'm not sure if that's true, right? That's what's really what was happening, but that brought up this time together because you have to be with each other for so long. And they were living in New York City, so they could not really leave their apartment for a very long time. That brought something much, much deeper. But isn't it the case, like the longer we're going to stay with someone, the more we are going to start accessing things that have been really buried that we cannot see after 1 month of dating. We cannot see if we're not in deep, long, committed partnership. And that might feel like life-threatening because those things are usually very well protected for a reason, right?
Yeah. And, on that note, like with, my definition of connection being basically in the same reality, uh, people, as you're saying, like defend their realities, right? This is where all of the political arguments come from. It's like, if you're questioning my reality, now I feel unstable as a human being. And it's quite difficult for most people to accept that there are other ways to view the world, right? Like maybe 80% of people maybe all people arguing on the internet just can't accept this idea, right? They want to somehow destroy the other argument. And in relationship, my wife and I will always see certain things very differently. Like she's into spiritual things that I'm not. I'm into various things that she finds incredibly boring and doesn't care. But as long as the things that we're looking at together, whether it's something in society or a moral value, or even sometimes like when it comes to cohabitation, like how you want to eat, I've had to separate from partners because we just like viewed nutrition so differently. And like, it's something that's so important to me, and it wasn't important to them, but they wouldn't budge. They wouldn't stop, they wouldn't change their diet. And I do think those things like kind of have to fit, which is where finding, if there is an idea of the one, it's the person who fits your value system enough where you're not having conflict on important things. Because even on the flip side, when the pandemic started, I know couples who viewed vaccines differently, but one person didn't really care that much. So it didn't become like one person thought like, oh, this has to happen. The other one was like, okay, and as long as there's some balance with that, I think it's totally fine.
Yeah. I mean, my wife and I have a slightly different opinion about it, right? And yeah, we didn't separate because of that. Well, we didn't think, okay, we should not agree with that. We see, something slightly different. And I ultimately think that when, we have very extreme or different opinions, the truth is probably in between the two, right? Neither me nor her on the real ultimate truth. What does that mean? And maybe, we are both just trying to attach a lot of value sometime on a certain topic, right? But like you said, certain topic might be key, right? About like nutrition was for you with that partner, right? Or it could be a certain political ideal or a certain view of seeing the world. Sometimes there are things that might be, well, that's really a deal breaker because there's really a misalignment on how we see the world, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of things, this goes for culture and for like relationships, maybe there is no objective truth, right? Like, if you look at how the common views change every generation, and when I think of culture, I'm thinking more on the society level. A lot of what people believe are right and wrong are kind of like, which side of the street should you drive on? Like, it actually doesn't matter as long as we all agree to drive on the same side so we don't crash. Like everything else, like whether, it doesn't actually matter. And I think this is true in politics, a lot of politics, and maybe not all things, and many things when it comes to relationship. Like whether you eat hot dogs or not, as long as you agree, who cares? Really?
Yeah. I still find it weird when people drive on the left side, but that
they're wrong.
They're wrong. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, so you and Nalaya are going to come in a few weeks at the sanctuary to offer a deep dive into all the amazing tools that you've learned the past 10, 15 years separately and together around sacred partnership, around relationship, around tantra and other elements of that. And it might be more retreats in the fall coming up. So can you just give us a little snippet into some of the tools or maybe some exercise that even people that might not come to this retreat and are listening today might find interesting to research about or to learn about in order to foster a better relationship, to foster that sacredness of connection between human beings?
Totally. And again, I want to say, like, our goal with this workshop is our goal in our own relationship and our definition of good relationship, sacred relationship, ideal partnership, which is in the relationship, you get to be yourself the most. And I do want to add that self might be different than your best self when you were single or in previous relationships before, but it is, it is like a flourishing of yourself so that there's no conflict in the relationship. So in the 3 days that we're gonna have, it's focused on couples, right? It's not for just practicing intimacy exercises with a stranger. It's for existing couples. The first day is going to be focused on clearing those defense mechanisms that we picked up, those traumas or micro traumas that we picked up from past relationships or maybe our childhood, where we learn to protect a part of ourselves, which usually comes out in a negative way in our partner and usually triggers their defense mechanism. So the first day is focus on breaking that negative feedback loop where we identify defense mechanisms, where we break them down. The second day is more focused on certain exercises we picked up from both of our time in the tantra worlds, where we're translating certain physical practices into really creating union, with maybe a mini goal of like having the kind of physical passion that you had when you were falling in love, which for a lot of people dies away. And there is a part of that day where we're going to separate the men and women to like really find their individual power, if you will, their polarity, if you will, to come together as full beings. And the third day is an integration day with co-creating reality, which is the other thing we spoke about today, is where, you know, can you have the same vision and build a vision together? Because if you look at the evolutionary purpose of why we care to have a partner, why any of those things are interesting, it is to create more life, whether you choose to have literal children or not. It's creating life together in a way that a single person literally physically cannot do. So yeah, that's the focus of the weekend. We're very excited to share different tools and yeah, meet some awesome couples who want to go in that direction.
That's beautiful. So before we close, you know, there's some people here listening. We have thousands of listeners on our podcast. So is there maybe one or two or three things, technique or kind of tips, things that people that are looking maybe to improve their relationship could explore or do? What I would be even say, well, that's the one thing you need to do, or the two things you need to do to really, you know, improve relationship and dive deeper together. Is there something like that, or there's none? There's just hundreds of them.
Well, there's a lot of things, but I'll go backwards in our conversation today because I think some good things came out, which is recognizing your defense mechanisms, right? Just having that awareness, because if you are having any kind of conflict, and I would say that feeling cold or indifferent is a version of conflict. Maybe it's not the dramatic version. If any of that is in your relationship, dissatisfaction, recognizing or trying to identify what is your defense mechanism. Like, what is your thing? Maybe it's going cold. Maybe it's getting angry. Maybe it's feeling like a victim. It could be any of the things we mentioned, but identifying it, because just having that awareness will bring something where you have a different choice. And I would say by having a different choice in your archetypal expression, it has to change your partners, right? If you're not being victim anymore, they can't play perpetrator. Like, it's impossible. They don't match anymore. So you'll have to find a new game essentially. And I would say another thing would be, and this might be just a discussion for everyone in a relationship to have with their partner, is what is your co-created vision for the now and for the future? I think it's a very fun topic, especially if you've been having unfun discussions or maybe things haven't been so interesting in your relationship. Like, we call it, dream time. Like, it's something we do after the baby goes to bed. Like we will say like, oh, you want to dream together? And we just like imagine what we want to do in the next month and the next year. And just having, that is as defined a shared reality that you can have your vision for your life together.
That is beautiful. I love that. Yeah, thank you. I feel that we've done that a few times together and with my partner, and it's been so amazing, right? Because maybe we had a conflict the day before or that same day, and then we talk about our big dreams and we realize they're so aligned, and we get so excited to do it together that it kind of brings us back into connection. Sometimes just kind of opening the space, right, beyond maybe the one thing that triggered us, right, that brought us there.
Yeah. And I think, we didn't speak about the differences between men and women too much, but in my experience, at least, that's something that tends to really matter for women. It's like, oh, they're included in the shared vision. And like, that's, at least I'll say in my relationship, this is true, where it's like a really strong almost like reconfirmation of love, like that we're sharing an envisioned future together, and it just makes you feel closer, and it's great. And maybe in some relationships the opposite dynamic, I guess it is not necessarily gendered, but I think it's just really great for reaffirming love.
Beautiful. Thank you, brother. Thank you
Yeah,
for
thanks, Angel.
your time today. There's so much more. There's so many things to explore, but yeah, so we are going to have this retreat in a couple of weeks. If you feel interested, I really recommend to come, because Nalaya and Ruwan just flew from Mexico, and they were in Peru before, and they're going to be in the US for a little time. So I highly recommend being there if you can. And if not, you can check the link that I will put under this podcast and this video about the websites that Ruwan's work does. And if you're a man, you can check that. And if you're a woman, maybe you want to work with Nalaya, who's his wife. But definitely, and I'm sure you guys are preparing some kind of offering together, right? Where we can do some online work with the two of you, no?
Possibly. Like, we're focused on this retreat right now, but
Okay.
maybe in the future.
I'm planning a seat there. I'm hoping that will happen. Thank you so much, brother. Thank you for the time. Thank you for sharing your insight, for being really authentic and grounded. I really appreciate that. It's refreshing, and it feels really nice to find that. And also, opening our mind, our hearts, our souls to really be vulnerable, and I guess radically honest with ourselves about what's really happening. And that's something I really, really love, that you carry as medicine, and that hopefully people felt today when they listened to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone. So you can find, all the details on the retreats and events as usual on our website, thesanctuaryheal.com. And we look forward to seeing you soon again. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Ciao.